Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar. My name is Sean Guy, Director of Programs and Operations for the Conference on Crimes Against Women. Also joining us is Lacey Hensley, Director of the Institute for Coordinated Community Response, which is powered by the Conference on Crimes Against Women. Let's get started with a few housekeeping items. Watch for your email for the webinar evaluation, accreditation, and recording of today's webinar, which will be sent within 24 hours. Also, we encourage you to use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to ask questions throughout today's presentation. If you'd like to make comments or interact with the speakers and fellow attendees, be sure to select the All Panelists and Attendees option at the bottom of your chat box so everyone can see what you've written. If you have any technical difficulties in that instance, you'll select the All Panelists Only option instead, and ICCR staff will assist. Before we begin, a little background on the Institute for Coordinated Community Response. Created in 2018 as a program of the Conference on Crimes Against Women, ICCR is a training and technical assistance program whose mission is to work alongside rural communities to improve their collaborative, systemic responses to domestic violence. ICCR works to accomplish this mission in two ways: by saturating the state of Texas with effective criminal justice system responses to domestic violence, and by ensuring every community across the United States, no matter how small, receives the training they need to provide justice for victims and hold offenders accountable. Each year, through our yearly cohort, ICCR works with up to 4 teams made up of law enforcement officers, prosecutors, and advocates from rural Texas counties to take a deep dive into their current criminal justice system responses to domestic violence and begin building the scaffolding for a sustainable CCR. The cohort year is completely free for selected applicants and includes an institutional analysis, free in-person trainings, and hands-on CCR support. Applications for the 2023 cohort are now open. In addition, ICCR's virtual trainings, like today's webinar, allows us to reach communities anywhere in the country. In all of our trainings, we work to center the unique needs and strengths of rural communities while providing practical skills and tools that can be immediately implemented. Although our trainings are geared towards rural needs, our trainings are relevant to any practitioners who are committed to eradicating domestic violence. So thank you for being here today and for your dedication to improving your own community's domestic violence response. You can learn more about ICCR on our website, www.instituteccr.org, and I encourage you to sign up for our e-blast to stay in the loop about all the great trainings we provide throughout the year. We have upcoming trainings virtually. We have the Rural Advocates Call on September 28th at 2 p.m. Central Standard Time. We also have the Rural Conference, Collaborative Responses to Domestic Violence in Rural Communities. Registration is open, and that's happening on October 3rd and 4th. And then we have an ICCR monthly webinar that will happen in November, and details are to be determined. And now, let me introduce our wonderful speaker, Sergeant Denise Jones from Clark County Sheriff's Office.
Hi, everybody. I'm Sergeant Denise Jones from the Clark County Sheriff's Office, which is located in Springfield, Ohio. If you're familiar with the area, we're between Dayton and Columbus. Just a little background on me. I have been in law enforcement for a little over 22 years, and I have worked in the Intimate Partner Violence Unit since 2017. I also serve on our SWAT team. I do consultant work for the LETAC for the Department of Justice, OVW, SPARC, the Stalking Prevention Resource Center, and a couple of other different agencies. I have facilitated some training and such at the Coordinated Community Response level and at the Crimes Against Women Conference in Dallas.
And may I jump in real quick while you're changing your screen, Sergeant? Sergeant Jones also has been engaged in changing her department's culture in responding to and investigating intimate partner crime, especially those involving marginalized populations. So we thank you for that. And you may take it away.
All right, awesome. So we're going to get started here. Maybe. So the objectives for today are to get a better understanding of these particular types of victims. And when I say these particular types of victims, I'm talking about victims of intimate partner crime or gender-based violence, how to work these cases without a victim. We'll talk about victim dynamics. We'll talk about working these cases without always having victim participation, and then understanding why we need advocates to do the work that we do. So let's talk about domestic violence. When we look at domestic violence, these crimes disproportionately impact women, girls, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and marginalized individuals in the United States. But it's not always just about the violence. And we look at these particular calls, especially as law enforcement officers in the group, these are the most dangerous calls that we respond to. And these are some of the most dangerous offenders that we may deal with. I know when we get dispatched to these calls and we go to the same house over and over and over again, we start to become a little more complacent with what's going on. However, just to kind of keep our guard up, I know in 2017, this was the most dangerous call that law enforcement officers responded to. This was where the most incidences of ambush and attack, and unfortunately the murder of law enforcement officers occurred. When you look at these types of offenders, and I know there's several studies that are out now, when you're dealing with domestic violence offenders, especially those domestic violence offenders that are using strangulation, these are the same offenders that are killing officers. These are the same offenders that are linked to be our mass killers, active shooters, and so forth and so on. So when we're looking at domestic violence, there is violence. There's a myriad of types of violence, but it's not always just about violence. It's about gaining and maintaining that power and control dynamic in a relationship. What does that look like in that particular relationship? You know, I know we've been to a lot of calls as advocates and other service providers. We deal with these kind of clients, survivors, victims, whatever that may look like in their process. We get a different kind of response, even though some of the situations are similar. When we also look at these particular types of crimes, it's not just an incident-based crime. So it's not typically just a one and done. This is more of a pattern or a course of conduct. When we're looking, it's something that's a habitual type of situation. Most often when we're looking at these particular offenders, it's not just that offender that we're dealing with. We're dealing with generations of offenders. We're dealing with master manipulators. A lot of victim minimization here, a lot of minimization period in society as we look at gender-based violence, but these particular victims will take a lot of the onus on themselves. And that has to do with their perpetrator. They'll minimize or diminish the perpetrator's role in what's going on and take a lot of that self-blame. So we really have to understand victim dynamics to kind of help these cases move along, if they do move along, understanding why they're not going to move along through the criminal justice system, and it's still being able to facilitate whatever kind of interaction that victim, client, survivor may need from law enforcement, advocacy, wherever you may fall on the service scale. A lot of these crimes go underreported, especially in marginalized demographics. You're looking at marginalized people, you're looking at people of color, low or no English speaking folks, deaf, hard of hearing, whatever that may look like in your community, that's going to even be a higher instance of underreporting versus not. Regardless, this is a high underreporting crime. And again, it's something that we have to take into consideration. A lot of times these victims are reaching out to advocacy and other service providers before they ever call law enforcement. Keeping that in mind when we're interacting with those individuals will be very beneficial. Again, talking about the serial nature of perpetrators, it's not just typically that perpetrator at face value. It's typically generations of perpetrators, understanding what those perpetrators are doing to us when we're out there as law enforcement officers. You know, what does that look like when we get out on scene? How do they try to spin us to stay out of cuffs? Whatever that may look like when we're out there. So let's kind of delve into it and let's talk about what we miss as law enforcement officers. Again, I've been doing this for almost 23 years. And so before I started in this particular line of work, and this is pretty much all that I handle. So I handle domestic violence, stalking, strangulation, protection orders, and some sexual assaults between intimate partners. We do have other detectives that handle the predominant call volume for our sexual assaults. But when I first started working these particular calls as a regular first line responding officer deputy, I missed a lot of stuff, and I didn't know what I didn't know until I knew a little bit more. So that's why I think training is extremely important. I know that in our jurisdiction, which is, in some instances either below or way across the United States, we do a lot of online training. And whereas I see the benefit for online training for law enforcement, I can only speak from the law enforcement perspective. I think that it really plays a negative aspect in how we learn as adult learners and law enforcement officers. When we're taking law enforcement officers out of the classroom, you're losing the ability to learn peer to peer. So I think that a lot of this stuff we don't get to really sit down and have good conversations about. So I think that it's really important, especially when we're all here together. I think there was 50 to 60 people in this particular webinar. Looking at what we miss is extremely important. As I was a first line responding deputy, I missed a lot of these co-occurring crimes. I really focused on tell me what happened today. And I know now that that's not how we should be approaching these calls. Certainly, we'll talk a little bit later about dynamics of law enforcement officers, but we're missing a lot of co-occurring crimes. Here in Ohio, when we go to a domestic violence call and we are going to make an arrest, or we're preparing to make an arrest, we're running a criminal case history. Let me look at what this person has for prior convictions, because for us, it's an escalating misdemeanor. So if there is a prior conviction of violence in a family with a family or household dynamic, then I can bump my misdemeanor charge up to a felony. So when we're looking at that CCH, we're not just seeing one particular genre of crime, especially with these types of offenders. But serving on the SWAT team, we do a lot of search warrants for drug trafficking, weapons charge, warrant arrests. And when I look at those, a lot of these individuals that I'm dealing with on the SWAT team, I'm dealing with domestic violence offenders as well as weapons, drug traffickers, habitual warrant arrests. So we really need to think about if there are other genres of crimes on their CCH, what are we missing when we're there? So we're missing some of these co-occurring crimes. And I have stalking, whether it's intentional or not, as number one. For me, in our jurisdiction, stalking is probably one of the most underreported, under-recognized crimes that we deal with, especially in domestic violence. And the nice thing about stalking, if there is a nice thing about stalking, is the fact that if I can get the victim to help me describe what that stalking component is in the relationship, I can go all the way back to the first incident of stalking, which now will encompass everything that an individual has been dealing with throughout the duration of this particular relationship, or when things started to turn south. So that allows me to get more evidence and information into court. Whereas if I just go to the scene and I'm just looking at domestic violence, assault, whatever that may look like, then I'm missing that ability to bring everything else with me. Weapons violations, as we know that there are a lot of firearms violations involved with domestic violence. Hazing, sexual violence. One of the questions that our deputies are mandated to ask when they go on these calls, and I'm sure that it's on some of the lethality assessments, is there sexual violence? Have you ever been forced to commit any sex acts that you didn't want to? What does that look like? Strangulation, threats, kidnapping, false imprisonment, child abuse, neglect, and witness intimidation. So when we're looking at these, 77% of intimate partner femicides, which is homicide of women, were by handguns. So clearly there are a lot of handgun components in domestic violence scenarios that we may respond to as law enforcement officers. 89% of those femicides, victims who had been physically abused, had also been stalked in the 12 months prior to being murdered. I've taken several stalking classes. I think it's extremely beneficial as a law enforcement officer. If you're not well versed on stalking, I highly encourage you to start looking into that. What do your state statutes look like? But if we can get in and start recognizing stalking early on, we're potentially preventing homicides. And ultimately, that's what we want to do as service providers, period, across the board. And then in over 50% of homes that have children, where there's an adult being abused, the children are also being physically abused. So making sure that we're not just looking and focusing on the small, what's going on in the totality of what we're dealing with when we're responding to these calls. So looking at why we miss it, and again, coming from a law enforcement perspective, I've been doing this for quite some time, I think we lack the information regarding and understanding trauma. When we go out to a scene, oftentimes because law enforcement, we are expected to be calm in the situations that we go to. No matter what's happening around us, we're expected to remain calm. We're expected to hold ourselves together and handle a situation. So we sometimes gravitate towards the calmer person. We really need to do a good job at looking at what trauma looks like and being able to explain trauma. And we'll kind of touch on it a little bit on how beneficial it is when you're working these cases without victim participation. A lack of communication. And I think that's lack of communication all around. As law enforcement officers, I think that we really try to work these cases, and a lot of our cases, very siloed. And that's just not the way that we can do things anymore. We really have to understand how all of these components can work together to be more beneficial to us as law enforcement officers and to be more beneficial to the victims and the clients and the survivors that we're working with on a daily basis. And I kind of touched on it a couple slides ago, but lack of training. Again, I can do Zooms. I love Zooms. We did Zooms for 3 years due to COVID and all the restrictions that we were looking at. But when you talk about training, especially law enforcement training, and I know that budgets are tight, and I know that when we look at training, we're trying to get the most amount of training with the least amount of expenditure and as fast as we can possibly get it. But I think that when we look at this particular type of genre of crime, when we look at gender-based violence and all the complexities that go into these particular crimes, really sitting in a classroom, learning peer-to-peer and being able to ask questions is highly beneficial because of the complexities of this particular situation, these particular types of crimes. There are so many things as law enforcement officers that we really don't know. And when you're looking at advocates, like they've been doing this work without us for a long time, and they'll continue to do this work without us. How do we get them involved and learn from them? I mean, I hate to say it, I know there's a lot of advocates in this webinar, and I know there's some law enforcement officers, but I will tell you, like, some of the best education that I've gotten has been from advocates, because we haven't always done things right, and we still aren't doing things right, and we could be doing things a lot better. And what we really need to focus on is coming together, training together. And what does that look like? It's okay to be in training together with advocates. They're actually really nice, and they bring really good snacks. So I know I got some really good advocates on this, so I want to give you guys a shout out. But again, going back to this language and cultural barriers, really getting out in your community, understanding what demographics are in your community. What do those demographics look like? What are their cultural barriers? What are their language barriers? Here in our area, we had a high Latinx community, and getting out and working with those marginalized individuals, they're not always receptive to law enforcement, and rightly so. So how do I work around that? How do you bring your administration in to say, hey, like, we need to serve these victims. We need to serve every victim. We have to meet them where they're at. How do we do that collectively as an agency? And how do we start to break down some of those barriers? And in every demographic, you have to figure out what that looks like where you're at. The LGBTQ community, the LGBTQ community hasn't always had a good relationship with law enforcement, and they still don't. And there are many reasons for that, but we still have to serve every demographic in our community to make sure that we're serving everyone in our community, and we're meeting them where they are, not where we want them to be, not where we think they want us to be, or where we expect them to be. We have to meet them where they're at, and understanding how we do that. Is insufficient supervisor oversight. I am a supervisor. I have been a supervisor in our jail division and our road patrol. It's very important as a first line supervisor that you're providing good training and good leadership and good mentoring to the individuals that are serving underneath you. I mean, they look to you as a leader. And if we're not correcting that in the beginning, then it's going to be a systemic problem and a culture problem in our organizations. We'll talk a little bit about bias, but our own personal beliefs and biases come into play, whether we think they do or we want them to. They're there. How do we work around that? How does that come into play, and how we're missing these crimes, and how we're missing co-occurring crimes, and how we're not responding correctly? Again, minimization by the victim or the perpetrator, a huge issue, and really kind of sidelines us as law enforcement officers, because when that 911 call comes in, we're looking at that as like, okay, this is a call, it's going to be a physical domestic, two people are fighting, and then we get out there and everything's fine. What's the victim telling us? What are they minimizing? What are we seeing when we get there? Taking in the totality of the circumstances and trying to push through a little bit of that minimization, and understanding why these victims choose or can't or don't want to participate with us is very important. And using advocacy is very important to move past this minimization by victims. Evidence can be often cross-jurisdictional, especially when you're dealing with stalking. Here in our community, only one thing has to happen in our community. So for us, it's 3 or more incidences closely related in time that cause mental distress, or when a perpetrator threatens or there's bodily harm involved. So only one of those instances has to happen in our community for us to then take everything else, use the totality of all of those things, and start charging for stalking. And then the biggest thing I know is the hang up for almost every police officer, including myself. It has been, it still is, and we're still dealing with it across the nation, is no physical injuries, especially when strangulation. So when we're looking at strangulation, I mean, we talk about it, 50% of the time, there may not be an injury for us to even see. And I think the numbers are 15 to 35% of the time, those injuries may be so faint, even if we take a picture, we're not going to see it. So understanding that's the most lethal form of domestic violence that we're missing, because we're solely focused on what physical injuries are present or aren't present, who has them, where they're at. Are we arresting victims based on a physical injury for self-defense on the perpetrator? So understanding how physical injuries come into play and how we have to use those to determine that predominant aggressor and make the correct arrest. So some of the impact of, when we miss, what we miss, is violence is going to escalate, and then often it can turn fatal. Certainly we want to definitely reduce any fatalities, domestic related, any fatalities period, but domestic related fatalities. If we're really doing our due diligence and we're working these crimes like we like to work our favorite type of police subject matter, everybody gets into this job because they want to help someone, and then they find their niche, they find what they really want to do, and then they really hammer home and they train in it, they excel in it. We have to be able to do that everywhere and be a well-rounded officer and not just be solely focused on OVIs or weapons or drugs or warrants or whatever that looks like. So if we're really doing our due diligence in the beginning, we can start to reduce some of these violence escalations and these fatalities. It really impacts our victims. If we're making bad arrests, if we're making dual arrests, if we're not really hammering home that predominant aggressor and doing our due diligence to determine predominant aggressor, and we're potentially arresting victims, then we've compromised victim safety. And I can guarantee you that case is done and that victim's never calling us again, even when they need us. So we really, really need to think about and really do our due diligence on establishing that predominant aggressor and making the correct arrest. There is a limited amount of time that we're going to make a dual arrest. And for making dual arrests, those dual arrests, each arrest needs to have its own separate report, its own separate statement of facts, its own separate perpetrator and victim. So making sure that we're doing our due diligence on scene, it compromises officer safety. If you don't care about victims and you're burnt out and you have no empathy and you're just at the end of it and you can't deal with it, I get it, but think about the next officer that has to go out there. We just lost a deputy a few weeks ago. He was shot responding to a DV homicide. We got to do our due diligence the first time. If I'm out there on that call and I'm not doing what I need to do, and I'm not making the correct arrest, or I'm not intervening and putting that person into shelter or whatever that looks like, understand what the next officer is going to meet. Do you want to be responsible? Do you want to shortcut a call and then compromise your partner's safety? I know there's no one that wants to do that. What's the liability of us missing co-occurring crimes? What's the liability of us not determining predominant aggressor? What's the liability of us getting an officer or a victim injured? You see it every day. Unfortunately, officers and departments are making wrong calls. I'll walk around the block, walk it off, cool off, whatever that looks like. And then that perpetrator goes back and either injures the victim or kills the victim. Now we're liable for that because we were out there. We weren't doing our due diligence the first time. Back to the victims, and honestly, back to the community. It's a complete loss of trust. If I don't do what I need to do and I'm not responding to these calls in a correct manner, then I'm losing the trust of my community. I'm losing the trust of my victim. I have worked with victims over and over and over again. I have worked with the same victim multiple times. I've had a victim in my office talking about how they didn't want to let me down because they didn't want me to feel like they're not paying attention to me, or they're not doing what I want them to do. And it's not about me. As law enforcement officers, we have to understand it's not about us. It's how can I help this person get to a safer place, get to a better place? What are my resources for this person to get them where they need to be? It's not always about a physical arrest. Do I want to arrest every domestic violence offender? Yes, I do, but it's not about me. If you're looking at victims of these particular types of crimes, they already don't have the opportunity to make choices. So we arrive out there and we tell them we're going to do A, B, and C. Now, certainly there are some circumstances where we have to make an arrest and there are no two ways around it. But if we have to, then it's a conversation. This is where we're at. This is why I have to do this. If we're not, what resources can I get? If we're taking the choices away from that victim, that might have been the first or the last time that they were ever able to give a choice. And then we've just been another person that took that away from them. So really understanding what our demeanor is when we're out there, controlling our outward demeanor, controlling the way that we react, and when we're exasperated and we're having a rough day, and this is the 7th time I've been to the same house, whatever that may look like, understand that next victim is watching. We cannot lose trust in our victims and our survivors and our clients. We can't lose trust in our community. Re-victimization, of course, if we arrest the wrong person, then we're re-victimizing them. If we're not doing what we're supposed to do when we're on scene, we're re-victimizing that person. Again, we've lost their trust. The victims hesitant to report again. Victims are already hesitant to report. There are so many reasons. I think there's a list of 50 reasons, and one of my advocates, she will tell you there are more than 50. There are tons of reasons victims hesitate to report. We don't want to give them yet another reason to not report again. And then we empower that perpetrator. So when we get out on this call and we let the perpetrator spin us, because these are master manipulators, and then we arrest the victim or we don't make an arrest, that perpetrator's won. We have to do our due diligence. We have to establish a predominant aggressor. We have to work these cases as if knowing that this victim is probably not going to be able to come back and participate with us, and do the best that we can to get these people behind bars if that's what needs to happen. So let's talk about the officer. Like I said, I'm an officer, 22, 23 years. We get frustrated. We go to the same place over and over and over again. Where we're at now, I think it was a few years ago, law enforcement applications nationwide were down 60%. I haven't seen that go up any, as meaning in our favor. I think the number's only getting larger. So we're doing more and more and more with less and less and less. What is society's perception of law enforcement right now? It's not always positive. It just depends on where you work and what your relationship is with your community. So we get frustrated, and I get it. We totally get frustrated, but we have to figure out how to work through that frustration and continue to do the due diligence and the good work that I know we're already doing. We have to think about our bias. I think someone's raising their hand. I'll stop right here. Okay. So we have to think about our own bias and where does that come into play. So when we look at explicit and implicit bias, so explicit bias is something that we're aware of and we knowingly disregard and continue to do what we're doing. We can't do that. If we know that we don't like a particular demographic or whatever that may look like, or we don't always get along with, or we don't always agree with, that stays at home. Our job as law enforcement officers is to interact with everybody in our community, bias-free, judgment-free, and completely objective, and to do the job that we're getting paid to do, and do it to the best of our ability. Implicit bias, we're not mindfully aware of that. It may impact our thoughts and our decision-making, but we're not completely aware of that bias may be, what that bias may be. So it takes a lot of work on our end as law enforcement officers, as service providers, really looking at what our potential bias may be, and then understanding that and working around it to ensure that we're responding to our community, especially marginalized demographics in our community, in the best way possible. And if that means that you need to go out and meet the people in your community, then that's what you need to do. I know that it can be tough. Different demographics don't want to interact with law enforcement for various reasons, but it's our job to bridge that gap. And our advocates can be a really good source of bridging that gap for us. And when I first started doing this back in 2017, we didn't really have a relationship with marginalized demographics in our community. And it took a lot of repair work, and it took a lot of taking ownership of some of the things that we did wrong and law enforcement in general. So what's that look like? I mean, you have to figure that out for your community. And again, meeting them where they're at and not meeting them where we expect them or want them to be is a huge step in the right direction. Going to community events, whatever that may look like. It's going to behoove you down the road to establish these connections now, because in the event something negative does happen in your jurisdiction, not even related to gender-based violence, then that community partner has your back because they know where you're at. It's harder to build those relationships in a reactionary versus proactively. So just keep that in mind, especially when you're talking to your administrators. Building these relationships now is going to help you in the long run. Social patriarchy kind of refers to the gender system in which men are in power and they dominate. What is considered masculine is more highly valued than what is considered feminine. So understanding what gender roles are in our society, how do those gender roles play a role in gender-based violence, especially when you're talking about the cultural differences, understanding what demographics are in your community and understanding what those masculine and feminine roles look like and how that may be a barrier for an individual to speak with you or for you to interact with that particular demographic. Again, getting to know your community is extremely important. Being trauma informed, and I'll give a huge shout out to the advocates. If you don't know how to be trauma informed, your advocates are trauma informed. What better source to learn from than the people that have been doing it for decades before us? They're it. And they're more than happy to help you raise your game when it comes to being trauma informed. So if your department is looking for trauma informed training and you have any kind of local advocacy, whether it be system-based, whether that be community-based, whatever that may look like, getting with those advocates and saying, hey, we really want to work on being trauma-informed. Can you come in and give us a class? Can you come in and talk to us? What does that look like? How do we start integrating that into our daily interactions with the victims that we're dealing with? I think somebody had a question.
It's been resolved. You can go on.
Awesome. Thanks, Sean. I know Sean's got my back. Okay, let's talk about the offender. Again, like I told you, this is not typically just a one and done offender. If we're looking at criminal case histories, what does that look like? These people don't just have one genre of crime. I mean, I've looked at CCH as going to make a domestic violence arrest with sexual assaults, drug trafficking, kidnapping, bank robbery. I mean, so when you're looking at these particular offenders, it's not like they just commit one genre of crime and, oh, no, everything else, I'm above that. I'm just going to do this. So what do these offenders look like? How do we have to learn these offenders so we know when we get out there what this offender is going to try to do to us to get us to not make an arrest or to get us on their side? And again, like I told you, as a law enforcement officer, we put a lot of stock and value in the calm person, the calmer person once we get out there. So understanding what that looks like, that calm person may not always be your victim. They may not always be your offender. Understanding these offenders and what that looks like for them. They plan these crimes. Again, I told you, there is physical violence and domestic violence, but we're talking about how to gain and maintain power and control over another person, over a household or a family, whatever that may look like. So these individuals aren't going to be doing this out in the public more times than not. I mean, does it happen? Absolutely. But they don't want everyone to see their crimes. I don't want an independent witness standing on the street corner calling in and saying, hey, I just saw these two people in a white van. The man was hitting the woman and the woman seemed upset. Now we have a whole witness that can be on the side of my victim and be a discounter for what I'm saying and how I'm trying to spin this officer. So understanding that these are some planned crimes, there's a lot of strategy that goes into this. If you're looking at physical injuries, and I'm dealing with predominantly female victims, I'm not saying there are no male victims, but predominantly I'm dealing with female victims. As an offender, I know that most law enforcement officers are male. Are they going to ask to see the bathing suit region of a female? More likely they're not. So how do I leave injuries? How do I put things where other people aren't going to see them, understanding what that looks like when we get out on scene, understanding that we may not see any injuries. We may see defensive injuries. We may see offensive injuries. If you think about it, and if you're talking about injuries, how many times have you arrested someone and left an injury without being injured yourself? And vice versa. You know, when we're talking about victims, and we'll hit on victims here in a few minutes, but understanding that when we do a use of force report, we have a whole policy, hours of training, body worn camera, other officers to navigate that with each other. So what does that look like for these offenders? They want to ensure there are no witnesses. I don't want anybody else to be on the side of my victim. I want to isolate them as best I possibly can. So I'm going to plan it. I'm going to try to ensure there are no victims, and I'm going to, if there are, witnesses. And if there are witnesses, those witnesses are going to be on my side. Understand how family facilitates domestic violence and intimate partner crimes and gender-based violence, having to work around that. They're very strategic, very calculating. They target those that are less likely to be believed. You know, we talk about human trafficking, and a lot of officers just see prostitution. I see at face value. So thinking outside the box, thinking past what you see at face value, I'm looking to target someone that's less likely to be believed. I'm going to test to select my victims. It's a grooming process. It's no different than human trafficking. If I'm getting into an intimate partner relationship, I'm not going to take somebody to dinner and smack them in the face the first day. There's a whole process of grooming that individual. And you have to understand that dynamic, because it's going to be different for each victim and each offender that you're dealing with. So what does that look like? How can you help that victim identify that grooming process? How do you articulate that in a report? So again, looking at these offenders and what they're going to be doing. Often, again, repeat offenders with multiple crimes and victims. I've worked multiple cases where I worked that offender with one victim, and now we're on to the next victim. So what does that look like? And are there any consistencies? Are there any similarities? How do you articulate that in the report? How can I use everything that I know about this offender to help me? Because they're not going to help me. So how can I use the dynamics of the offender? How can I use prior interactions? How can I use prior protection orders? How can I use all of these things about the offender and the end in my report, in my investigation, to make this case more about what I can provide versus what I'm expecting my victim, client, survivor to provide? That's ultimately what we're looking at here. Again, is violence going to escalate over time? Looking at the recantation wheel, I'm pretty sure that there's a social study out there. It's Meet Me on the Hill, where we first parked. It's a really good article. It's not a long read. You're talking about the recantation wheel and what that looks like, where victims start out and how that moves through the process for offenders to get the victims back on their side. I've worked with a victim, and literally in a 72-hour period, there was over 100 calls from our jail. In the beginning of those calls, my victim didn't accept. And then as the time went on and she started to wear down, now she's accepting calls. Calls are lasting 2, 4, 10, 12 minutes. What's that offender telling that victim? How can I use that? These are all jail calls. How can I use that for my case, for my investigation? What does that look like? Is this relationship going to escalate over time? Absolutely. Think about your careers. Think about all the victims and the survivors and the clients that you've worked with. Has it just stayed right here? No, typically it's going to escalate. So how do we prepare for that? And how do we work that into our investigation? What does that look like for us? So let's talk about victims. They're not going to be that perfect or normal victim. Plenty of us as law enforcement officers have been out to a burglary. And when I get out to a burglary, that person wants the full CSI. 45 minutes minus the commercials, button it up, get it solved, get DNA, get fingerprints, boom, we're out. That's not going to be this victim. They don't usually want us there. If there's kids involved, they definitely don't want us there. They don't want us to contact any kind of children's services, any kind of social services outside of that arena. This offender wants to isolate this victim. This victim has been told everything that they need to hear by the offender to make sure that they stay on the offender's side. You call the police out here, they're going to take your kid. You call the police out here, you've got a warrant. You have to find what that looks like in that relationship and be able to articulate that in your report. But they're not going to be that perfect normal victim. They're not going to be crying and upset. They may be mad as hell. Think about it. If I were strangled, or if I was sexually assaulted, if I were physically assaulted, if I were manipulated, never had access to money, never had access to go and do anything by myself without that being monitored and regulated, I'd be pissed too. And I'm sure most of us would. What does that look like? They often delay reporting. How can I articulate in my report why that was a delay? Because as a defense attorney, it's going to be a delay. Oh, they're probably lying. How do I combat that? So it's like thinking about what you're going to encounter if this goes to court when I don't have victim participation. What does that look like? Experience or in a state of trauma because of the violence. We'll talk about trauma briefly. I probably need to speed it up because I love to talk about this stuff and I'm sorry, but we'll talk about trauma. We'll hit on it a little bit and what that looks like for each individual person. They're often threatened. They're often afraid. They're often reluctant. If you're getting the full court press from an offender, you're going to be these things. Understanding what that looks like when we're working with them. They feel powerless to stop the violence. They've probably never been believed. This may be the first law enforcement interaction, but that does not mean that this is the first assault that they've ever had. This does not mean this is the first contact they've ever had with anybody in regards to what's going on in that relationship. They absolutely have vulnerabilities that the perpetrator will exploit. And think about your own personal relationships. If you've been with anybody for any extended period of time, that person knows how to push your good buttons and your bad buttons. They know exactly what to say that's going to make you smile or make you angry or make you sad. So that comes into play. Your experience as a human comes into play with what you're dealing with here. They often don't trust law enforcement. Again, when you're told everything that possibly can by the offender, that offender is trying to keep that victim on their side. So they don't trust us. You know, if they're a marginalized demographic, they definitely don't trust us. They don't want to get in trouble and they don't want to get the suspect in trouble. And I know that that's really hard for us to understand as law enforcement officers, but we have to understand victim demographics. We have to understand what that looks like in order for us to articulate that and work the case if the victim can't choose to or won't come back and participate. So understanding trauma, one of my advocates, she's the best advocate we have. I think she sums it up. I know there's a whole definition here, but she uses it as your response is a normal reaction to an abnormal experience. So it's your response to an event or a series of events or a set of circumstances experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening with lasting effects. Those lasting effects might be on your functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. Working in this field, anytime past a week, I think, you're going to experience trauma. It just looks different for everybody. And it may take somebody longer to get there. It may take somebody a shorter amount of time to get there. You know, what does that look like? So what happens when the body experiences a traumatic event? We do not control how our brain and body respond. Like I told you, we just lost a deputy about a month ago. I was involved in an officer-involved shooting. And once I was getting shot at, like my body took over. My brain said, we're going to do what we want to do. And your decision-making capabilities are suspended right now because you're dumb. You brought us into this situation. So what does that look like? It's the fight, flight, freeze reactions. It's the body's natural survival skills with the goal of self-preservation. Your body and your brain are like, hey, dummy, like we're doing some stuff that's not going to keep us alive or keep us safe. Like, how do we fix that? And we're going to fix it right now. And your decision-making skills are over. What's that impact on behavior, demeanor, emotions during and after the event? Understanding that this may be different for everybody. It could be dependent on where they're at. This may not be the first offender. So what does that look like for the individual and how can you go in and document it? Your complex thoughts, they're impaired. Your memory ability is impaired. It affects how they're stored. It affects how they're retrieved. So when you're going in and you're doing these interviews and these conversations with your victim, ask sensory questions. Don't make them stay on a timeline. Don't start to finish them. Tell me what you remember. Let them get the account of events out before you start asking all these questions. If you're using body-worn cameras, are you able to use that body-worn camera when you go back to write your narrative? I do it. It's very beneficial for me because I don't miss anything. I hate to take notes. I will tell my victim that, hey, like, I'm recording this. If they don't want me to record, is that in your policy? I will ask. If I'm just meeting them in the office with the advocate, or if I'm meeting them in my office, I explain to them, hey, I ask them, is it okay if I record audio visual? And if they say no, do you mind if I record audio? Because I don't want to divide my attention. I want you to have my full attention. I want to be able to capture what you're saying, so I can completely, capture your statements for my report. They're often not too negative about that. You just have to have a conversation. So again, responses may change from person to person, and for one person during an incident, and from incident to incident. Yes, you've been doing this work long enough as law enforcement officers. We are exposed to trauma on a daily basis. So it may not hit us on this incident, but it may hit us down the road on something that's so small and minute, but bam, it's going to trigger what you got going on there. So understanding that, being able to articulate it. How does the body respond? That flight, fight, or freeze, flee if possible. I look at it like a deer in a headlight, or a rabbit that you spotlight. It stops. Like, oh, something's about to happen. And then what happens after that? You're preparing for action. You may freeze, you may flee, you may negotiate. What does that look like? Again, we have to ask really good questions to get this information. We have to understand what that victim is seeing, what they're hearing, what body language means to them. Again, they may try to escape, they may try to mitigate injury, withstand harm. The brain makes some subconscious decisions around survival. Your brain wants you to survive. What does that look like? Explaining this to your victim. And if you have body-worn cameras, being able to explain trauma to your victim gets that same conversation into the courtroom. I don't know how many prosecutors, if any, are on this call, but when we started doing this work and really trying to elevate our response to these particular types of crimes, I went to the prosecutor, like, hey, tell me what we're doing right, wrong. How can I introduce trauma so then I can talk about trauma? Because the defense attorney is going to use delay reporting, inaccurate statements, changes in statements, that person's behavior to discredit them. How can I use it to our favor? How can I say, well, this is trauma. This is what trauma looks like. You may experience these things. This is trauma. And then my prosecutor can delve into trauma when I'm in court with my body-worn camera footage. So why is it important to know all this? Being able to explain trauma to victims, again, especially on your body-worn camera, is crucial for them and can assist your cases. If you're talking about or taking a case forward without a victim, getting as much of that on yourself, like making you as the law enforcement officer the predominant provider for facts, evidence, information, and not relying solely on your victims, elevates your case, and it enables you to take these cases forward with little to no victim participation. So what does that look like? How can you can articulate that? And if you don't have body-worn cameras, how can you articulate that in a narrative? If we can articulate in a narrative, in a report, everything that we see, hear, feel, smell on an operating a vehicle under the influence or whatever, DWI, whatever that looks like in your jurisdiction, we can do it on these cases. We just have to take the time, we have to educate ourselves, and we have to use knowledge to do that. So what does it look like? So when you respond to these calls for service, we have to be prepared to work with victims who won't be what we expect. They won't be that, hey, somebody broke into my shed, somebody broke into my house, somebody stole my car, I want my stuff back, I want them to go to prison, I want reimbursed. We're not going to see that on these crimes. Can we? Yeah, predominantly no. We have to be able to understand what that looks like for reporting and documenting in our reports. How can we, again, be that predominant provider of facts, evidence, and information? We have to be able to explain trauma, not only to the victim, but we have to be able to explain trauma, period. We can get that into court. We can help eliminate what that defense attorney is going to use to discredit our victim. Okay. So what are the reasons why? And again, I told you, I gave my advocate 50 reasons why. And I don't know if she's on here, but I'll give her a huge shout out, Lauren Dennis. She's probably responsible for educating me 90% of the good stuff that I do. The other 10%, I don't know where that came from, maybe Sean Guy. But the reasons why are individual for those people. We can't expect to understand everybody's reason on why they choose not to participate. We certainly have to understand why they can't, why they won't, why they don't. How can we use what they have going on in their situation? How can we use that, and how can we get them services? If we're looking at reasons why, are they afraid? Sure, they're afraid. Are there children involved? What's the money situation? If I'm the sole provider for money in my household and I abuse my significant other and then I have to be arrested, where's the money coming from? Who's going to pay the bills? Who's going to get the food? And to flip that around, if I am the sole provider of child care for my family and I'm the abuser and my victim has to go to work, who's going to step in? Understanding what that looks like. Even if there's domestic violence, there's still going to be love in that relationship. I know we may not understand it, but it's not up to us to understand. Everyone in this webinar can't say that every relationship they've ever had was positive, but there wasn't still love involved. So understanding that we bring this knowledge to these cases, how do we articulate it? How do we work with it? How do we service these particular people, even though they don't want to go forward with court? How can we still get them services? We victim blame. Society victim blames. Working around that, being trauma informed, being victim centered, being victim focused, using advocates who already do this a heck of a lot better than we do. And they're really good at it. Everyone in their life blames them. So when you're looking at power and control dynamics, if I'm an abuser, I isolate my victim. I don't want anyone interfering. I don't want that victim to have anybody to reach out to that's not going to be on my side. I want to isolate that victim so they don't have a safe place to turn to. They can't leave me. So if it's going to be the victim's family may blame them because they won't leave. If it's going to be the offender's family is going to blame them because they keep calling the police. They get the kids taken away. They put the person in jail. We have to understand all these reasons why. We have to be able to work around these. The offender may be a pimp. There may be prior abuse. The offender is going to apologize. The offender is going to apologize. If you're not listening to jail calls, you are missing a mountain of evidence. A mountain of evidence. Usually that first call is where we get it. It may not always be an admission of guilt. It might be an I'm sorry. It may not be anything. The victim says, you beat me, you did this, this, and this, and that person doesn't immediately say, no, I didn't. Is that something we should be putting in a supplemental narrative? Absolutely. Is that something I should be picking up the phone and calling my prosecutor? Absolutely. Offender's going to make promises. I'm going to do A, B, and C, whatever I know that victim wants me to do or hear to get them back on my side and get them to drop charges or not participate in court. That offender is going to take children or pets. They're going to use them as a token or as a pawn. I'm not going to come back, or I'm not going to do this until you bring the pets back. You're not getting the pet until you do this. I'll kill you. I'll kill myself. I'll keep all the documents you need to be here in the country, whatever that may look like. If you're intellectually developmentally disabled, am I your primary payee? Am I the person that takes you everywhere and gets everything for you? Can't read or write. The shelters are full. Man, if your shelter's not full, congratulations, because every shelter around us is absolutely full and has been for years. That's a struggle. So what, as service providers, what's the next step? What does that look like? No access to services is if you're completely rural and you are just isolated because of where you live, how do you even get services out there? Do you have a shelter that will take pets? What does that look like? If I'm putting someone in a shelter, I'm making them homeless. How do you work around that? What do you have set up in your community to work around that? Again, isolation and depression. So many reasons why. If they're a public figure, if they're LGBTQ, have they tried to leave before? There's no help. The offender has found the victim. The offender's stalking the victim. What technology are they using to facilitate these particular crimes? No access to medical care. There are so many reasons. This is just a few short lists. So many reasons. You have to, as the responding officer, get to why they can't choose to, won't, or don't participate with us. And how do you get them services? Working without a victim. We do it every single day in homicide cases, and we get convictions. So what does that look like? How do we approach this? When I first started this program back in 2017, one of the very first things I did was go and talk to our prosecutors. Hey, you're seeing our reports come into court. Tell me what you like. Tell me what you don't like. Where are we deficient? Where are we proficient? Where do we need a little more work? Where do we need a lot of work? Let's sit down and talk about this. I will bring you coffee. I will take you to lunch, whatever that looks like. Like, we're here to help you. And I know that we get pissed as law enforcement officers at prosecutors every day, because I want to hammer everybody, and the prosecutor dismisses or they plead down. As law enforcement officers, we have our role in this system. Our role is to put our best foot forward as we possibly can. How can I deliver the best case that I possibly can? How can I follow up to get more information? What does that look like? So you got to be willing to see where you're deficient and clean those up. You have to do thorough investigations and reports. You have to. If we can do it in every other area, the things that we like, I used to love to find drug traffickers. I could write a 3 or 4 page narrative. We got to do it here too. We got to use everything. Working with Crawford, the no face, no case. Basically, the accused shall enjoy the right to be confronted with the witnesses against them. So let's talk about, real quick, let's talk about hearsay exceptions. What's that look like? Hearsay, it's an out-of-court statement offered for truth, right? So if we're looking at what can we use in our reports, that 911 call, that excited utterance, that statement relating to a startling event or condition made while the declarant was under stress or of excitement that it caused. If I'm calling into 911, I'm typically excited. I'm giving you that excited utterance. Pull it, keep it, send it to your prosecutor, use it. Did they contact anybody before or after, directly after they called 911? Who is that? Can I call them? Can I talk to them? Are they here? What does that look like? Again, we're using everything that we can. Another is a statement made for medical diagnosis or treatment. If there's a strangulation or an assault, are you calling EMS personnel out there? So we're looking at it. It's a statement made for and is reasonably pertinent to medical diagnosis or treatment. It describes medical history, past or present symptoms or sensations, their inception, or their general cause. Man, if I can get that EMS person that they actually like, because we don't, firefighters and EMS people they're great, they're gospel. Law enforcement officers, we're not always the nicest people. So, hey, what did that lady tell you when they were back here? Like, work around HIPAA. What does that look like? Get their names, put that name in that report. Let your prosecutor figure out if it can come into court, let that prosecutor figure that out. But we're trying to get everything we can and get less of the onus on the victim and more of the onus on us. That's what we're looking to do. Then existing mental or emotional or physical condition. It's going to be a statement of the declarant's then existing state of mind or emotional, sensory, or physical condition, such as mental feeling, pain, bodily health, but not including a statement of memory or belief to prove the fact remembered or believed unless it relates to the validity of the terms of declarant's will. Forfeiture by wrongdoing. This directly relates to Crawford. So Crawford gives you the right to confront the witnesses against you, right? So an exception to the confrontation clause is basically the person should not be able to benefit from their wrongdoing. So if you're listening to these jail calls and your offender's on the phone, like, don't come to court, don't come to court. If you come to court, I'm going to do A, B, C, and D. And that person doesn't come to court, your prosecutor needs to know that. So when that defendant engages in a wrongful act designed to prevent the witness from testifying, such as threatening, killing, or bribing the witness, your prosecutor's got to be on that. Giles v. California. For this to apply, obviously, the prosecutor must establish that the defendant engaged in the wrongdoing with the intent to make the witness unavailable. This goes for intermediaries. So again, we're looking at that as jail calls. What's your jail mail look like? Is that victim coming back in and saying, hey, there's a no contact order and this person's stalking me. They're doing A, B, and C. Again, it's going to be dependent on every single case that you're dealing with, but we have to know what these exceptions look like, and we have to be able to pull that information and evidence and give it to our prosecutor. When I look at these cases, nothing different than a homicide. It's everything and the kitchen sink. I want to get everything that I possibly can on my own, taking less onus off that victim and putting more onus on me as a law enforcement officer. Because listen, this is the thing. I'm not afraid to come to court. We don't know each other. I'm not in an intimate relationship with you. You don't scare me. My job is to take you to court. My job is to do A, B, and C. And if there are charges that I am the sole provider of evidence, testimony, and information, I'm charging it because I'm going to come to court. I understand why my victims can't, won't, or don't come back to court. I'm going to come to court. Send me a subpoena. I will be there. We're looking for those 911 calls. Any prior reports, whether that be just calls out there for service, whatever that may look like, any orders of protections, whether it be past or present. Information shared prior to or directly after the 911 call. Again, did you call anyone before or directly after you called 911? Have you shared your story with anyone else? Is there anyone else that's familiar with what's going on in your household? Again, what can I charge that the victim doesn't? I don't need the victim's help. I went to a domestic violence call last week. The victim chose not to participate with me, which I completely understand because there's some children's services issues, but I found a gun and drugs. So I seized that gun for safekeeping. I took those drugs, obviously, and I submitted them for testing for touch DNA and what the substance was. Because I will charge that offender with that. And my victim doesn't have to come back and testify. I'm the sole provider for that. We've had instances that we've worked particular cases. There's been strangulation, threats of killing, sexual assaults, kidnapping. That victim, that was the victim that I talked about earlier, multiple calls over a 2 or 3 day span. She then ended up not coming back to participate. But as I'm listening to jail calls, he's a convicted felon, not allowed to have a firearm. He's calling the side person and saying, hey, baby, sell my gun. I need money. So we get a search warrant, go out to the house, search it, find the gun. I put him in prison for not being precluded from carrying a firearm. So what can I, as a law enforcement officer, charge with that I don't need that victim to come back with? Talk to the neighbors. I'm not saying go out and isolate your victim even further. You have to be very careful. But if it's anonymous call, how can I get in touch with the anonymous caller? Is the victim down the street saying, hey, or is the victim down the street just watching? What's wrong with walking down there and saying, hey, what's up? What's going on? Is there anything that you can tell me about what goes on out here? What does that look like? Other individuals in the household, can you talk to kids? Do kids just want to come up and talk to you because you're in a uniform? These are all things that you can use to put in your narrative to help your case. And again, put that onus more on us, less on the people that we're working with. The jail calls, jail letters, jail visits, jail video visits, jail messages. What does that look like? Other victims. Have there been other victims? Does this person have the same MO? What does that look like? What does your state law say about this kind of stuff? Develop your probable cause. Don't solely focus on injuries or the lack thereof. Think about it again. If I'm a law enforcement officer and I'm involved in a use of force situation, do I always leave an injury? Am I always injured? How can you get your victim there? When that victim tells you, well, I saw the look, or the offender said A, B, or C, well, tell me more about that. That's my favorite question, my favorite statement. Tell me more about that. What's that look like for you? As law enforcement officers, we already know, well, I was out there, they flinched, they tightened up, they dropped their right foot back. They told me they were going to do A, B, and C. And we already know all this stuff. These victims don't have that advantage of going to the same schools that we go to, learning the same information, having policy that we can literally just sit there and help write our narratives. How do we get that victim where they need to be? What questions can we ask to get them there? Do you have to be hit in the face as a law enforcement officer before you react? Do you have to be shot before you react? Do you have to be strangled before you react? I mean, think about this. We're no different than these individuals that we're working with. We're just law enforcement officers. What does that look like for us? We don't have to be hit, kicked, bit, stabbed, shot, whatever that looks like. We know when we're looking at an offender, oh, it's about to go down. I'm about to get into a fight. How do we get that victim to give us that same information and in their own way, in their own manner? What does that look like for them? Tell me more about that. Using good interview techniques. I know it's not always possible. I know it's tough. Like I said, we're doing more and more and more with less and less and less. We're going call to call to call. You have supervisors that push you off calls, want to know why you're on this domestic violence call or whatever call for too long because you've got calls holding. It's a 24/7 operation. We have to do our due diligence, separating those victims and those offenders and those witnesses and out of ear and eye shot and getting a good statement. I know it's not always possible, but we need to try to make that our standard practice when at all possible. I know that sometimes we have to go to a domestic violence call by ourselves. I get it. But how do we mitigate what's going on there so we get the best interview that we can? And man, if you're not using advocates, you're missing out. We cannot expect to do this work without advocates. They have been doing this work for a lot longer than we have, and they're really good at it. And we have to use them because we're missing so much if we don't. So why we need advocates? We're a rural community as well. I mean, we do have a city in our jurisdiction, but I can't work with the 850 to 900 individuals that I deal with on a yearly basis. There's 2 of us. We don't have the time and the ability to handle every single one of these people. And that's where our advocates come in to help. They're able to be that constant contact, or that more prevalent contact. Now, certainly I'm here. I'll give them my cell phone number. They can text or call me if they need me, but they're more comfortable typically interacting with that advocate. We can't do this without advocates. Victims call advocates. I think the last time I heard the number is 7 to 9 times more, or 7 to 9 times before they ever call us. So 9 times out of 10, this advocate's already going to know this person that you're working with, or they're going to know that they're a repeat victim, or they're going to know it's a repeat offender. So can advocates help us? Sure. I mean, are there limitations? Absolutely. How do we work around that? How do we get their knowledge into our practice? How do we put their knowledge into our toolbox? How can we use them to help better serve these clients and these victims and these survivors? What does that look like? They are trauma informed. They have been trauma informed before we knew what trauma informed was. If you are lacking in trauma informed response, reach out to your advocates. I know as law enforcement officers, we kind of see this as an adversarial interaction. I totally get it. We have to understand, we have our part of the pie, they have theirs. They are here to advocate for that individual. They are their advocate. That's their responsibility. It might not always jive with what we need to get done. They get irritated at us. We get irritated at them, but we have to work together. We have to. We cannot serve these victims, these survivors, or these clients without working together. It doesn't work. There's an agency next to us. I see them try to do it every day, and it doesn't work. And the only ones that suffer are the people that we're trying to help. So these types of crimes, they're a community response, not an individual entity response. And I know that I've kind of hit a lot of that, and I just did, but no one person, no one entity can do this by themselves. Again, when I first started this job in 2017, we had no relationship with our advocates whatsoever. And it took us to sit down and have conversations and build a relationship and repair relationships and continue on a daily basis to manage those relationships. That's what you have to do. It's a relationship. You have to cultivate it. You have to water it. You have to feed it. You guys are not always going to see eye to eye. The advocate I work with, I think she thinks it's her job to give me a hard time, but we work well together. We have professional courtesy and respect. And honestly, without these advocates, I couldn't do what I do. They work with these victims. We work down at a jail. Above me, I'm sure you've heard it kicking and banging because we have another unhappy customer upstairs. These advocates are able to talk to these victims, and because we have such a good rapport, are able to get victims down here to our jail in our office to report. That's huge. It just takes getting outside of your comfort zone and building and maintaining relationships so you can all address this issue together, because not one agency, not one person can do this by themselves. So I think that's it. Any questions? I'll be happy to field them in the chat or the Q&A, whatever that looks like. But Sean, I'm all done.
I love the passion that you have for this work, Sergeant Jones, like seriously. And then you tie it all together. I mean, you not only did you explain how the advocacy and the law enforcement partnership can work, but also how people can present a case when the victim doesn't participate, which I know is very prevalent. I just learned about that at a conference I went to last week. That was their main concern in Central Illinois, is victim participation in cases. So it's just awesome. If you all do have questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. And while you're doing that, Sergeant Jones, you can read your kudos in the chat box. And then I'll just go ahead and let you guys know as we're wrapping up. No need to take it to 3:30 if we don't have to. So please watch out for your email for the webinar evaluation. We really, really would appreciate you all filling that out. The feedback helps us with future trainings. And also it allows you to get your accreditation certificate, which we would like for you to have. So when you get the email, fill out the evaluation, access your accreditation certificate. And just so you know, the recording of today's webinar will be sent within 24 hours. Any questions, folks? Okay, also Sergeant Jones will, I'm saying this, I know she'll probably agree, will be presenting at the Conference on Crimes Against Women, which will be in Dallas on May 22nd through 25. She does a very good job. She spoke this year on predominant aggressor with Dave Thomas, also about law enforcement and how law enforcement can stop, look, and listen to victims and really get the meat that is needed for cases to be successful. So let's see, we have a question. Oh, let's see. Okay, Raven, do you have free time in your schedule to go out to communities to consult with police officers, Sergeant Jones? Oh, you said yes.
I'm trying to do your job too, Sean.
Say it again. Okay.
Yes.
And I guess Raven or those that are interested would just reach out to you via email. Is that the best go?
Yeah, email. I think I put my work cell phone number on there. Either way is usually pretty good. They make me carry my work phone all the time, 24/7. It's great.
All right. Okay, Annette has a question. You're typing it, but I'm going to read it out loud for everyone.
Okay.
Any suggestions on creating an effective working relationship between advocates, law enforcement, and the prosecution?
So for us, it was really just getting everybody in the room together and having honest, hard conversations. I don't know if she's on here. Lauren Dennis is our advocacy supervisor. She and I did a class. Well, she made me do it, but we did a class basically for law enforcement and advocacy to interact. Like, what does that look like? What are the limitations for law enforcement? And then on the flip side of that, like, what does it look like for an advocate? It's beneficial for me because not every law enforcement officer understands, like, advocates have a different role. And we as law enforcement officers don't always like it when other people's roles don't intercede with our roles. And we have a role to obviously establish probable cause. If arrest needs to be made, then we make it. But advocates don't have that same role. And so it's sitting down and understanding, like, what each entity or person, what their role is, what that looks like, and how they can all intertwine to kind of bring the best foot forward. But it was just sitting down and having hard conversations and just creating that safe space. Like, this is not a blame game. This is not, it's us against you. It's anything like that. Like, how can we all come together as a community to better serve our community? And certainly if you want to reach out to me, you have my email, you have my phone number. I have no problem getting on a Zoom and just having a conversation with everybody, and whatever you need, just reach out to me and I will help as best I possibly can.
Okay, thank you for that. Another question, when working with advocates, what has been the biggest challenge? This is a two-part. What has been the biggest challenge, and what can we do or what do we already do to best support your portion of a case? And so I believe we as advocates.
Yeah. So for me, when I first started this work, it was just understanding your role as an advocate. I can advocate for someone, like I can try to advocate for them, but that's not my role. Understanding what your role is and what that looks like. What does confidentiality look like? What does privilege look like? And then trying to explain the flip side of that. Like, for instance, like I said, a lot of people come into our office, and I have had a whole class, a whole conversation with every single advocate that comes in this office. Like, understand this. If you bring a victim in here and there's a visible physical injury and they tell me A, B, and C, there's nothing I can do. I'm going to make an arrest. I'm going to file a warrant, whatever that looks like. I will go so far as I will give statements out. I send a statement out via email to our advocates and be like, hey, Have your person sit down, write a statement. I'll look at it. We'll have a conversation about it and we'll go from there. If they want to go forward, then here we are. If they don't, then here we are. Here's what I got to look at. So it's really just about sitting down and having a conversation. But for me, the hardest thing was understanding like what your role was and how that was beneficial to me. Because as law enforcement officers and as humans, we're selfish. How's this going to benefit me? How's it going to help me get to where I want to be? It's kind of like what I looked at. And what was the second part of the question? I think it dropped off my screen here.
Oh, here, I can.
Oh yeah, here it is. What can we do, or what do we already do to best support you? I will tell you this, like getting a law enforcement officer on your side and then you guys co-facilitating training, because nothing is more beneficial to me when I'm talking to advocates to have an advocate standing right next to me saying, yeah, what she's saying, that's it. That's it. And vice versa. So if you're trying to sell something to law enforcement, you have to have a law enforcement officer backing you up. No different than if you're a judge or an attorney or a doctor. If I go to try to tell a bunch of doctors about strangulation, there's going to like, you're just a cop. You don't know what you're talking about. So it's being able to co-facilitate that and kind of just starting out small, like dropping that seed, then just start watering it and feeding it as much as you possibly can, and then just spreading and watching everything grow. But you guys already do a good job. It's just, like I said, just learning each other and having conversations. Be willing to keep each other accountable, but don't take everything so personal unless you have to, because if you do, then you do, because the cops can be assholes. But don't take things so personal. Understand that we each have a role in what's going on here. And some cops just don't want to hear it. And sometimes you just don't get past that barrier. And like I said, like if there's anything you need, like all you got to do is shoot me a text, shoot me an email, and I will help as best I possibly can.
Thank you. And then we have one more question. Oh, I mean, there's others are welcome, but one more in the queue. So Eileen is finding that victims will tell her prior events, history, etc., instead of telling the detective. Do you find that same thing happening?
Absolutely. So for me, again, and I wish Lauren was on here because she could tell you, the nice thing about it is it's like, I don't think that our advocates ever try to sway anybody one way or the other. But the nice thing about the working relationship that we have is that they know me. They know that I'm trauma informed. They know that I'm victim centered. They know how I work. And so they're usually able to talk to that victim and reassure them that it's not going to be like an interaction with like a first line officer, that they're not going to be trauma informed. They're not going to understand. And so like, really, that's really been beneficial, because they'll tell advocates far more than they'll ever tell me. So, and I know that our advocacy agency uses like a release of information, but typically it's the victim coming in here and talking to me, and I'll tell them ahead of time, like, this is the thing, like, what I'll ask, what do you want to see happen with the information that you're going to give me? Or do you want me to use this information to file charges? Do you want me just to document this for you? What does that look like for you? Do you want to have a conversation about it? And then I'll explain our options after we're done. Keep in mind that if you tell me A, B, and C, then I may have to file a warrant. And I try to be just upfront and honest, but you advocates get so much more information than we do. I'm kind of jealous most of the time, but yeah, I mean, and if you can have a really good working relationship with law enforcement, that is just so beneficial, because then we can start working and investigating the additional information that we get.
All right. So much information. Great insight. Thank you, Sergeant Jones, for sharing your time and expertise with us. Just one more time, please watch for your email attendees for the webinar evaluation, accreditation certificate, and recording of today's webinar, which will be sent within 24 hours. I want to thank Lacey Hensley for joining us as well. Again, if you didn't catch it in the beginning, she is our Institute for Coordinated Community Response Director, and she'll be working with a lot of you folks who work in rural communities. Yeah, so thank you once again, everyone. Thank you, Sergeant Jones, and I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, guys. Please stay safe. Again, reach out to me. I will help you as best I possibly can. Thank you very much for all the work that you do.
All right.